Well, welcome everybody. You are sitting in the Foreign Animal Disease Depop and Disposal session. Thank you for coming. Real briefly, it's very complicated and a lot of moving parts in this overall picture that we're talking about a part depopulation disposal of today. Emergency plans is probably what I've already alluded to as I've been giving you my spiel. But there's other components that we're not going to focus on a lot in here, but certainly need to be part of your awareness as you try to put the whole program together, as I've alluded to. So understanding signs and symptoms, and unfortunately, if we use African swine fever as kind of a model for what we're scared of and preparing for, that has a lot of clinical signs that are very similar to domestic diseases you see every day. So you're not going to walk out necessarily and immediately say, ooh, that's ASF. So the quicker, if it would in fact be ASF, the quicker that we realize that and recognize that as an industry and deal with it, the better off we all will be. So make sure over time you get enough education to share with folks that are around you at the pig farms and whatnot, or what they need to be looking for, and just simply the context. It's nothing to be scared of, but it's certainly something you want to be aware of so we can make the right decisions as we use our veterinarians and diagnostic laboratories and whatnot to make sure we don't miss something that could have been an opportunity to control an outbreak quickly. AgView traceability platform. The previous talk was about CHIP, swine health information program. Is that right? That's some of the traceability work that is being originated out of Iowa State right now, and it's modeled on the NPIP, the poultry program that's been in place since the 1930s, just related to some strategies and monitoring and whatnot related to certain diseases across flocks. And all that really funnels into what I've alluded to several times here, just rapid response. The more organized and prepared we are ahead of time, even though it's sort of a pain, the more we maintain that accurately and up to date, the better the response is, and the quicker we can get the right people involved, the quicker we can get things under control. And the whole key, even though it doesn't sound very exciting, is get back to normal. So export pork, move your pigs, all the things you want to do that you love related to producing food for our country and the world.
So we are talking about depopulation and disposal in response to a foreign animal disease today. It's not something that we necessarily want to be thinking about, but we still need to be prepared. We can hope for the best, but we still need to plan for the worst, because what I've been told is that hope is not a plan. So we still need to plan ahead. So in a foreign animal disease, your state veterinarian is going to have two main objectives. Number one, contain and control that disease. Thank you. Number two is to get you back in business as quickly as possible. To be able to do those two objectives, they're going to go through a 5-step process that they have to complete before you can get back to business. So those 5 steps are a foreign animal disease investigation, the state animal health incident management, which would include your indemnification, depopulation, disposal, which are the two things we're talking about today, and then finally disinfection. So like I said, we're talking about depopulation and disposal today. The faster we can get through those 2 steps, the faster your state veterinarian can get you back into business. So we need to help them help you. They're very busy. We need to come up with a depopulation and disposal plan that will work at our own facilities to help your veterinarian. Put that plan in your back pocket. Figure out what works for your facility. Put that plan in your back pocket. That way, if there is a foreign animal disease, you can pull that plan out of your back pocket and say, hey, I have this plan, and it will expedite this whole process significantly. When you leave today, you're going to have seen an overview of the different depopulation and disposal methods. And you will also know where these resources are located so that you can start this planning process for your own facility. I also want to mention that what will work for your facility may not necessarily work for your neighbor's facility. So encourage your neighbors as well to go through this process on their own and identify the depop and disposal that will work for their specific facility. So just remember, the faster we can get through these 5 steps, the more expedited we can make this depopulation and disposal occur, the faster we can get back to business. So with that, Stephanie Wisdom is going to come up, and she is going to go through our depopulation options. Stephanie?
Thank you, Marguerite. All right, so we're going to start out talking about depopulation. And the first thing I want to do is kind of level set about what depopulation is. And so we're going to start with the AVMA definition, which is the definition that the swine industry has adopted. So definition, according to the AVMA, is the rapid and efficient destruction of a complete population of animals in response to urgent circumstances, with as much consideration given to the welfare of the animals as is practical. So this is what depopulation is. Depopulation is not, however, the same thing as euthanasia. So we're going to see some differences here. And when we're talking about methods, you will see a lot of the euthanasia methods that we use on farm listed as potential depopulation methods. However, not all methods of depopulation can be used for euthanasia. So there are some differences here in what we're talking about. And the reason for that is that urgent circumstance and that need for rapid response in response to this emergency situation. So this is what we're talking about here today, is this type of depopulation. You can see here at the bottom, we've got these 2 big circles. Today, we're going to be focusing on having an emergency plan for your farm for depopulation so that we can ensure a rapid response. And this rapid response, as we've been talking about and we're going to continue to talk about, is so that we can focus on business continuity for your farm and get you back to normal, like Russ was just talking about. We're going to first go through some of the resources and research that National Pork Board has done on depopulation. So this is not a new topic for National Pork Board or our research by any means. Our focus on depopulation research for National Pork Board started back in 2019. So about that time, we first identified African swine fever in China, and we started to see ASF spread throughout China. And in response to a concern and really an overall fear that we would see African swine fever come to the United States and see the need for depopulation on our own farms here in the United States, we started an immediate focus on what are our depopulation research needs, our resource needs for our producers here in the United States. So in early 2020, we focused heavily on depopulation research using checkoff dollars. And here on the screen, we've got some examples of a few, but not even all, of the depopulation methods that we have researched. Starting in 2020, we immediately took action and jumped into research, funding 5 different research projects on different depopulation methods. Here we do have a high-level list of some of the research that we've looked at, but looking at initially a response to ASF, but as we all know, 2020 had a lot of surprises for us, right? And as we started going in through 2020 and we saw the spring of 2020, we started to see that supply chain slowdown within the pork industry. We started to see that bottleneck, and we started to see pigs on farms start to become overcrowded. And so then we started looking at depopulation on farm for some other reasons. So not just depopulation on farm for reasons for regulatory diseases like ASF, CSF, like we talk about quite a bit, but now we're looking at depopulation due to a market disruption. So once we started to see that, National Pork Board kicked in again, led by our producers, led by our task force. They immediately responded by doing some quick turnaround depopulation research. 4-month span depopulation research on farm, doing some validation so that we can get information into the hands of our producers on this topic when they need it, and they need it now. So doing some very quick turnaround research based on the needs of our producers throughout 2020. Thankfully, we did not see a lot of depopulation happen during that time, and especially none due to a regulatory disease, but we did continue that focus because we know that this is still a concern for our producers. So in 2021, we had 6 more projects focusing on, what are the next steps, what are the needs now for our producers in these different areas, and foreign animal disease and depopulation research is going to continue to be a focus for our research here in 2022. The methods that you see here, like I mentioned, are just some of the depopulation methods that we've looked at. We started this process by looking at a literature review. What are the needs in the literature for us to focus on? What do we already know, and what do we need to build upon? Starting at the top, looking at foam. Through our literature review, we know that there was nothing in the peer-reviewed literature on foam, either nitrogen-filled foam or water-based foam for use in swine. And so that was one area that our producers felt very strongly that we needed to look at. And we, of course, said of depopulation that could be available to them. So foam was one area that we looked at quite a bit, and we funded 4 different research projects on nitrogen-based foam and water-based foam for depopulation. Again, looking back at that literature review, foam was one area that was not looked at all, but carbon dioxide was the method of depopulation that we saw was most studied. And so we did not need to do extensive research around CO2. We needed validation research in that. So CO2 focused more on validation and how will our producers utilize this method on farm? What sort of setup will they need? What sort of sourcing will they need for utilizing CO2? The other methods that we've got on the screen going down, carbon monoxide, gunshot, penetrated captain bolt, sodium nitrite, and electrocution, all other areas that we looked at with varying degrees in there. They were in the literature somewhere, and then again, how can we support, fill in those knowledge gaps with our research and to our producers. These methods on the screen and all the others available are categorized by the AVMA. And so these are all listed in the AVMA guidelines for depopulation document. And this is the industry. However, the foam, since it is a newer method, foam at the top is not currently listed in the AVMA guidelines for depopulation. And this is going to be important to our producers. Why? This is because if it's not listed within the guidelines for depopulation, we may have impacts on indemnity. So the USDA goes back and references this AVMA guidelines document for indemnity. So we're working now with our research to make sure that this information, peer-reviewed research in the media, how are we presenting this back to AVMA? So we are working with AVMA collaboratively to make sure that they have the information they need. So next year, starting in 2023, when they review that document, they have all the information they need to consider it and support it and include it in their document and have that recognized. All of this research that we've been talking about here, dozens of studies that have been funded on this topic. So if you go to porkcheckoff.org/research, you can go review all of the research studies that have been completed up to this time. We also have a whole host of online resources that can be available to our producers around depopulation, depopulation planning, and documentation after the fact. On the right hand of your screen, you can see we kind of got this triangle document or graphic, and this graphic was created specifically to talk about how National Pork Board collaborates with our different partners for depopulation research. Traditionally, looking back in the past, Pork Checkoff National Pork Board would collaborate with our academics, our academia partners, to focus on animal-focused or farm-focused research. Sometimes with private industry as well, but typically with academia. As we were looking at some of this quick turnaround research that we needed, some of this validating on-farm research and needing this very quickly, we started to broaden our scope of who we needed to collaborate with. And so we started working more directly with our producers, working within their barns. How are they going to test out some of these methods that need to be validated for depopulation? So this is one thing that's come, one positive aspect that's come through this depopulation research is this increased collaboration and partnership throughout all of our different groups for research. And all of this research was led by our producers. This is not something that we as staff, this is not an effort that we have come up with. This is all efforts and guided by our producers on our Depopulation and Foreign Animal Disease Research Task Force. So we work with producers from across the United States, all different levels of production, different types of production, to tell us what they need, what are the areas that they want us to focus on. So this is an area that's been very important to our producers and an area that we're going to continue to focus on. Using this research and the information that we've gathered, we are currently at National Pork Board creating a new resource to compile and curate all of the information for depopulation and disposal. We know that as we continue to fund this research and get more and more projects, the information starts to grow. So how can we put this information resources that we've created into a usable format for our producers? And again, working with them, hearing their feedback in this space, we've heard that they would like a single source reference document for this information. So how can they easily find and search information on all of these different depopulation methods as well as disposal methods that they would be looking to include on their on-farm plans for depop and disposal? So Pork Board's been working on curating all of the knowledge and resources that we've got from the research that we funded, other resources that are out in the industry, and then other literature review, peer-reviewed literature that's out there that's going to be relevant to our producers. Again, putting it in this kind of one-stop shop reference document for them to go back. So while they're building their plan, and then later, if there is to be an incident, they can quickly go back and reference this and get the information that they need. So this is currently set to be released next month, and we're very excited about this. So coming soon, July 2022. All right, and as we segue and talk about this, I'm going to lead into Marguerite Tan to talk to us about disposal.
Hey, thanks, Stephanie. So when you are able to access next month, yay, when we have this swine depopulation and disposal field guide ready for you to be able to utilize, you will see that there are 5 different disposal methods included in there. They're going to be all on-farm disposal methods. And that's important to differentiate that the of a foreign animal disease, we will likely not be able to move pigs off of a premise. So we're focused on those on-farm methods. 5 on-farm methods is pretty limiting, but that's what we're working with right now. But Pork Checkoff is actively working on developing new disposal methods. And we'll talk about that here in just a little bit as well. So let's talk about these 5 methods that we are currently working with. So incineration, deep pit burial, whole carcass composting, ground carcass composting, and shallow burial with carbon. This last one, shallow burial with carbon, you might have also heard called above ground burial. It's the same thing, it's a little bit nicer name. So as we move on with these, each of them have strengths and each of them have weaknesses. This is not a one-size-fits-all shop. You will have to go through each of these and determine what will work for your facility. So going back to what works for your facility might not work for your neighbor's facility. So the initial 3 things you need to think about when you're thinking about this disposal: the equipment, inputs, and time. Let's start with equipment. Incineration. It requires a specialized piece of equipment. It's going to be kind of tough to get a new incinerator installed on your site if we have an emergency. So that's stuff that we need to think about ahead of time. Deep pit burial, fantastic. I love it. Equipment. There's one piece of equipment that's required: backhoe, hydro hoe. Most of us have those on our farms, or a neighbor has it. So that's a really pretty easy one to manage equipment-wise. But then we're looking at, say, ground carcass composting. It's a fast way to be able to dispose of carcasses. That's the good news. The bad news is it requires a very large grinder, which I don't know about you, but I don't have a large grinder sitting on my farm operation. Likely you don't either. And these large grinders require oversized load permits to get them from point A to point B. So we need to be thinking ahead about those potential challenges. Inputs. Incineration. This is gonna make me sound like I'm totally bashing on incineration. Incineration, it requires a lot of really expensive fuel right now. I don't know if you've checked your fuel prices, but incineration is pretty dang pricey right now. What else do we have? Composting. These last three options all require carbon. And when I say carbon, in the form of wood shavings or wood chips, potentially corn stalks, but high quality carbon is preferred, cooks better. To give you an example of the carbon needs for whole carcass composting, if I have a 1,000 head barn, that's a finishing unit, and those animals are close to market size, or they are market size, I am looking at needing 30 semi-loads of carbon to be able to correctly compost those animals. That's a lot of carbon for a 1,000 head barn. It's 1,000 head. Okay, so we're at 30 loads of carbon now for whole carcass composting. On the flip side, I have this great thing called shallow burial with carbon. That's only gonna require 10 semi-loads of carbon. Okay, 10 semi-loads of carbon is still a lot of carbon, but that's a lot better than 30 semi-loads of carbon. But you can start to see where just the carbon needs alone can be very challenging depending on where you're located. If you're located in a state that's carbon poor, being able to obtain that amount of carbon can be very problematic. But I'm happy with my 10 semi-loads of carbon. I'm gonna go with shallow pit burial with carbon. Fantastic. Now I'm looking at my time. That is going to tie up that piece of property for 12 months. And maybe that's okay if it's a piece of property that I'm not using, but if it's a piece of property that I was actively farming and I just needed more space, so I had to put this shallow burial with carbon area in that piece of space that otherwise I'd be growing crops on, that's a lot of time to have that ground sitting there just cooking carcasses. On the flip side though, if I'm looking at that whole carcass or ground carcass composting, I'm only gonna be tying up that ground for 2 to 3 months. So like I said, each of them have their strengths, each of them have their weaknesses, and you will have to work through each of those options and determine what works for your facility. I also want to add that if you utilize composting for your daily mortalities, you still need to go through this, because what works for your daily mortalities may not be of sufficient size to handle the quantity that you might need to handle during a foreign animal disease. So once you've considered that equipment, inputs, and that time, and you've kind of started to pare down your list, maybe you've taken 1 or 2 off, there's some other considerations that we need to go through. Here's some other considerations. Virus inactivation, available real estate, distance to groundwater, that becomes a really important one, soil types, well and surface water locations, topography, state regulations, including disposal allowances and setbacks, and deed restrictions. This is starting to remind me of some jeopardy here. Let's actually go through a few of these scenarios so you can see how some of these other considerations might work. So let's start with deep pit burial. Okay, let's start with virus inactivation and deep pit burial for 100, please, Alex. Deep pit burial, one of the big challenges with it is the virus inactivation time can be very uncertain depending on your ground conditions. It may occur quickly, it may not occur quickly. It's a big question mark. That's something that needs to be thought about. Available real estate, deep pit burial's your man. It's great, doesn't take up a lot of real estate compared to some of the other methods. Distance to groundwater, the elephant in the room. If you have a high water table, mark deep pit burial off your list right now. It's not gonna work for you. Soil types. Deep pit burial is mostly and fairly forgiving with different soil types. But while we're on the subject, I want to add, take a look at this, what would that be? The graphic on your right-hand side? I guess that's on your right-hand side. The NRCS has a really nice soil survey tool for us, and you can mark off the different types of disposal methods you're interested in, and it will tell you about how that soil type handles whatever type of disposal option you might be looking at. So for this particular example, we're taking a look at composting. So you'll see that red area, that's not a good compost area. The yellow stuff is pretty good. So that's something to think about as well. Well and surface water locations, that's gonna be important for you to look at no matter what disposal method you consider. Topography, burial is pretty good for different topographies. It's one of those friendly things. It's kind of a free gimme. Like, depending on your topography, no problem. Likely we can bury. It's not the same with all of them. State regulations, some states you're allowed to bury, some states you're not allowed to bury, and some states are saying, hey, you can bury, but you can only bury a certain number of pounds per acre. The states that allow you to only bury a certain number of pounds per acre can be problematic for foreign animal disease disposal planning. So just keep that in the back of your minds as you're going through this. And finally, deed restrictions. Depending on the state you are in, if you want to bury, there are deed restrictions. You have to record that on the deed for your property, which means that that particular little red flag will show up in perpetuity on that deed for that property. So keep that in the back of your head as you're going through these, thinking about these options. Now let's look at something completely opposite, composting. Composting, virus inactivation, fantastic. I can tell you exactly when those viruses are inactivated, typically between 1 to 3 weeks. I can do it by a thermometer and say, yes, we hit it. That's always nice to have that certainty, unlike the deep pit burial. Available real estate, this is where the composting starts to be problematic. Takes up a lot of real estate. Distance to groundwater, there we go. It's a plus for composting. I can have a super high water table, and composting is environmentally safe with that high water table. So, you know, pretty well completely opposite right now of deep pit burial is kind of what we're looking at. Soil types. Composting is a little bit more sensitive to different types of soil types than deep pit burial. But the great thing is most of the time, if we have, say, really super sandy soils, we can put some engineering controls in place, like put a layer of clay down to be able to compost on top of, and it takes care of that challenge. So it's something that we can overcome. Like I said, well and surface water locations, always important no matter what we're doing. And topography. This is where composting gets to be a little bit more challenging. It's a lot more sensitive to topography than, say, deep pit burial. You cannot have water running across the ground on your compost site, because if you do, it's going to wash your compost piles away. And we don't want that. That would be really bad juju. So, and then deed restrictions, those are mostly negligible. But I say mostly in that there may be a few situations where those are applicable. And then state regulations, some states are really easygoing with composting, other states are not. And then there are some states in the middle which are like, hey, as long as you have a permitted site, you can compost. So, like I said, there are advantages and disadvantages to all of these. There are different considerations that you need to think about. Some of these disposal options will work for your facility. Some of them will not work for your facility. Once you've pared down your disposal options to, say, 1 or 2 or even 3 disposal options are okay, that's the time to sit down with your State Department of Environmental Quality. Go through those disposal options with them. just in case, because like I said, state regulations vary. Some states will be like, hey, that's great. Ta-da, you're done. Other states, they're gonna be like, well, that's a great plan, but we really don't allow that. This is the time to find out they don't allow it and then ask how you can overcome that. So for instance, in the state of Colorado, if you are a permitted swine facility, you are not allowed to do shallow burial with carbon. It's just not in their state regulations. It's not that they're not in favor of it, it's just not in their state regulations yet. They're like, next time we update our state regulations, we'll include it, but until then, sorry, it's off the table. But if you go in and you talk to them, they will give you a provisional permit to be able to do that practice in the situation of a foreign animal disease. So there's wiggle room there. You just need to go in and talk to your State Department of Environmental Quality beforehand, not when the disaster occurs. So another thing that I talked about was we currently have 5 on-farm disposal methods. We need more on-farm disposal methods. So the Pork Board came up with the 2022 Pork Industry Innovation Challenge, which is titled for this year, Finding Innovative On-Farm Mortality Management Methods. So pig farmers are the original innovators. You see this lovely thing here? Lovely postcard sitting on your chair. If you didn't get one, I'll make sure to get you one. If you want extras, we have extras. Pass them out to your family, friends, neighbors, anybody else you can think of who might be interested in this. If you have a disposal option that's in your head that might be a great idea, please enter it into this challenge. That's the website for the challenge. We need more innovators. We need more disposal methods, and we think the best people to come up with those brilliant disposal methods are pig farmers themselves who have experienced determining and figuring out how we can dispose of pigs. So if you have a good idea, submit it to the website, and you can win up to $46,000 for a good idea. Like 2 or 3 sentences. Hey, I'm going to use dung beetles to eat up my carcasses. Hey, that might be a great idea. Congratulations. You might have been able to get awarded $46,000 for that brilliant dung beetle idea. So if you have great ideas, if you know people who have great ideas, please encourage them to enter the Innovation Challenge. Like I said, postcards are on your chair. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Stephanie to wrap up.
So I think you're all hearing today that the emphasis here is on being prepared and understanding what are your next steps, what are your plans around depopulation and disposal, especially around foreign animal disease response. So as we get into that, I want to go over some key questions and considerations for you as you've got that topic on your mind. The first question for you is, what are your options? Hopefully we've explained several options that you as producers all have for you in terms of depopulation and disposal. And again, we have lots of resources around all of those available to you, and we're here if you have any questions. And next is, what are your resources? Again, we've listed those resources, but that's not all you have, right? Marguerite mentioned several groups that you can reach out to for questions on disposal. You as producers have your state associations available to you to answer any questions that you have. You also have your SAHOs or your state veterinarians available to you if you have any questions. And National Pork Board is always available if there's anything at all that we can help you with. As you're thinking about your different options and what's going to be included in your plan, different considerations I want to highlight for you. First one is animal welfare. As you're thinking about depopulation, what are the options, what are the methods that are going to protect animal welfare most on your farm? And that's going to be different from farm to farm. We know not every farm is the same, not every situation is the same, so you're going to need to think through each of these as it relates to your own operation. thinking through these different methods, what are the impacts on biosecurity? In a time of foreign animal disease response, are you utilizing methods that might have blood loss or might have fluid loss in some sort of way? And biosecurity is going to be a consideration for you. In disposal, Marguerite talked quite a bit about, what equipment are you going to need? What sort of real estate or land area is going to be required? Talking about carbon or things like wood chips that's going to be available to you. What are these different methods? What are going to be the requirements for these different methods to think about? And then state regulations. This is going to vary, especially around disposal, from state to state and maybe even areas within a state. So this is where working through the different groups that are available to you are going to be very important. And so last question is, what are my next steps? And I hope you've heard this call to action many times here, is we're encouraging you now to build out that plan. Work with these groups to build out would you do if a foreign animal disease was found on your farm tomorrow, found in your area tomorrow? Who would you call? What are your immediate next steps? Where's the equipment you would use? And before I leave you, I want to leave you with a reminder of what some of these resources were that we talked about today. First off, our farm emergency planning resources. These are our online resources. You can go to porkcheckoff.org, find these under our hot topics section as far as planning around depopulation and disposal. This is include all of the online resources we've got for you, including a depopulation checklist, what you're going to need to do step by step, carbon sourcing information, and other information there for you. The Depop and disposal research, I went through that pretty extensively. Again, all that information is online there for you to review, walk through. This is very practical on-farm research that can be done and many times duplicated on-farm. And again, porkcheckoff.org/research for that. Marguerite talked about the innovation challenge, so more information coming on new and novel methods around mortality and different ways to dispose of mortalities. And then coming soon, our Depop and disposal field guide, so that quick reference guide for all producers, veterinarians, anyone in the industry working around this tough topic.
We want to help you now. And if you heard me yesterday, I mentioned this is your industry and you need to plan now. And I'm going to take you through a scenario of one of several that we've just gone through with avian influenza. And there's a lot of similarities of how it went and how it could go with ASF. But I'm going to be like Russ. I'm going to use an analogy that's maybe not necessarily appropriate for the pork industry. But when I was in animal science a few years ago, the beef teacher said the last day to wean your calves was the day you turned your cows out onto the stock fields. The last day to do foreign animal disease planning and plan on your farm is the day the foreign animal disease hits, because you're not going to have any time to plan at that point. Things have to start clicking and start moving and happening because you're going to be faced on your farm. And Marguerite and Stephanie have done a wonderful job here of laying out all those pieces you need to be prepared for. But the gaps there yet are how you execute those things on your farm. And that's what's key. And I'll take you through an example of what we've gone through with the avian producers and how some of those things happened and what we stepped through with them. And the first thing I'll say too, and Amanda was here, Amanda Chipman. Good, there you are. This year with avian influenza, not only Amanda, she's our emergency management coordinator, which I'm thankful for. Here, as we move forward, I can stop taking as much omeprazole and she can start worrying about everything again. But our staff in the field has done a tremendous job the past several months, and I'm not the expert up here. It's all of our staff and what they've done, and the producers in Iowa, how they were prepared going into this avian influenza outbreak. We had 19 detections of avian influenza in Iowa. 15 of those were commercial premises. In 2015, we had 77 commercial premises in Iowa that were infected, or 77 total. There was only a couple that were backyards. And I think a couple of the main things that's attributed to this year is producers had biosecurity. They knew what to look for, what to be prepared for. There were some early warnings from other states. We weren't the first states to have outbreaks. But we also took a very aggressive approach to mass depopulation. And we depopulated the birds very quickly on the farm, so there wasn't risk of disease spreading from those farms. Now, I will be the first to tell you too, there's probably, you know, whether bodies of water around farms, migratory birds, what factors those had played into it, because it appears what work's been done on the virus so far and trying to compare, was it lateral movement or point source introductions? It looks like most of them were point source introductions, which is again good, that attributing that producers had biosecurity in place so there wasn't lateral spread from one site to another. But I'll quickly take you through a scenario of how, and this was very similar to most all of our cases. We would get a call, and I apologize some of you that heard this yesterday morning, but when we would get a call from a producer, veterinarian, that they said they had clinical signs on their farm, the first thing we did is, if they didn't already have samples, we sent somebody to the site, but we quickly determined how likely those clinical signs were of avian influenza. That's a difference that we may not have the exact luxury with ASF to say it really looks like it, but if turkeys were laid out, there was high mortality, feed and water decrease, that was a very good sign. And so what we started doing as the department, we would mobilize our people if we weren't already mobilized. And the specific example I can remember very vividly is on a Sunday morning, we got a call at 11 o'clock. And we got everybody into the Wallace building, started our incident command. But what we also started doing with the producer immediately, we started asking them several questions, including, what is your mass depopulation plan on your farm? How do you plan to do that, and how quickly can you get it done? Because our goal is within 24 hours or as quickly after that as possible. We also asked, what's your disposal plan on your farm? How do you plan to dispose of your birds? We'd also ask them epi questions. We'd say, what connections does your farm have to other farms? And again, keep in mind, they called at 11 o'clock. We're already starting this within a couple hours. Samples are being submitted, so we have no results yet at this time. We also started drawing the control area around the premise, starting to identify what other farms were near that premise. So we're starting to do a lot of work right away to try and figure out who's connected to this farm, how we're going to take the next approaches. We also started talking with the producer jointly with USDA, and all of this is in a joint unified command between the USDA and the state of Iowa. And again, as Marguerite and Stephanie pointed out, there may be differences from state to state. So what I'm describing is how we operated in the state of Iowa. So started those discussions, not negotiations, discussions with the producer on indemnity for the birds. And paperwork had to be filled out and sent to the USDA, along with, back to mass depopulation. One of the main ways birds were depopulated, mass depopulated in the state of Iowa this year, was through ventilation shutdown plus. And we had to fill out a formal request to the USDA to ensure that the producer was also going to get indemnity, depending on the type of mass depopulation they used. So in those few hours, we're starting to do all that work, because we want to make sure that if we get a positive diagnosis, the next steps are going to start triggering and happening very quickly. So on that Sunday, by 4:30 that afternoon, and in Iowa, we have, I'll say, the luxury. NVSL is the confirmatory lab for avian influenza. With ASF or FMD, we're going to have to go to Plum Island, so that's going to extend out this timeline. But by 4:30 on that Sunday afternoon, we had confirmatory results of a positive case. So we were ready to present to the owner the indemnity form for them to sign and agree that, and so everybody understands, there is an appeal process, but it enables us that if the producer doesn't fully agree with what they're going to receive for indemnity, they can appeal that. But what we want to make sure is we have the ability to move forward very quickly with mass depopulation. So we had that form ready. We had the form ready that if the producer wanted to choose VSD plus, and the two main ways mass depopulation occurred in Iowa was with either VSD plus or foaming. So we had that document ready to go. And the producer themselves had already started planning how they were going to do VSD plus on the farm. You know, how they were going to wrap fans, if they needed extra heaters, but they were ready to execute also when we had those confirmatory results. So they were executing VSD plus within several hours of that confirmatory result. by the next morning at 11 o'clock, within 24 hours of them calling with clinical signs, the site was mass depopulated. And the reason I'm pointing that out is when Stephanie and Marguerite, mass depopulation is different than euthanasia, okay? And that's something that is a key piece that everybody needs to understand. During a foreign animal disease outbreak, we have to stop the spread of the foreign animal disease, and we have to do it quickly. We're not ignoring animal welfare by any means, but mass depopulation does not meet the exact same requirements as euthanasia. Because if we don't stop the spread of disease to other sites, we're going to have many more animals or birds infected than are what at that site. Because it's actually a huge lesson that was learned in 2015. The longer a positive site's sitting there with animals that are shedding virus into the environment, and you have people going on and off of those sites, the greater the chance you have that that disease could spread to another site. But I hope, and the piece when Marguerite and Stephanie were going through that, we still have both state, federal, and industry some challenges on how we get mass depopulation done quickly on sites. Because there aren't a lot of methods yet. There are some that we can utilize that I think we can get close to the 24 hours, but it's going to be critical that we make sure. Because if you look at ASF around the world and the countries that have recently been infected with ASF, if we have that narrow opportunity to stamp out and eradicate ASF, we need to make sure we're ready to do that. Because most of the countries that have been infected recently have not done that, and now we're facing years of facing that disease. And when you start talking about trade, and if you want to start talking about regions, but if we're not very aggressive at the beginning, we're going to be faced with a big problem for a long period of time. So a lot of our sites, that scenario was very similar. We started mobilizing, working with the producer. So I hope the reason I wanted to step through that example is so everybody understands, and why I said the last day to do your planning is the day of the foreign animal disease outbreak. As a producer, you're going to be faced with, I need to mass depopulate my site. What compensation indemnity am I going to receive for that taking of the animals? Am I going to bury out back? Am I going to compost? There's a lot of things that you need to have in place. It is very, in Iowa, the DNR is your good resource for whether you can bury the water table, be reaching out and making those plans. So I wanted, so as Marguerite was going through the different options of disposal, I want to point out a few things of what we've also gone through here in examples. But the mass depopulation, have a plan. Be ready. Because we'll help you, and we can help you now, but a key piece is whether it's me or somebody in the Department of Agriculture at some point during the outbreak, Amanda's smiling because she knows exactly what I'm going to say. You're not going to like us. You're going to say we're the evil regulator. Well, and
What's the size of the maximum size depopulation?
5 million, 5.3 million. So you won't like us, and you may not like your neighbor either, because the way it can, and we're actually releasing a control area today. When we draw a control area around an infected premise and we quarantine all of those facilities around an infected premise, the way that control area is released is what steps are taken on the infected premise. So there are people that are held up in the control area on how long it takes for certain steps to happen on the infected premise. So we've talked for years about the haves and have-nots and who has the disease and doesn't, but we're all in this together. But it depends during the outbreak where you're at in your relation, whether you're in an infected facility or near one. So it's important, again, that you have plans in place because it affects everybody. Disposal, the two main ways disposal has occurred in Iowa is composting and burial. And then we don't have deed restrictions in Iowa. Actually, there's a producer that's 2015 chose not to bury because of the rumor mill that went around that you had to record that on your deed. They did composting. This time they're doing burial. But there are challenges with all of those. And the composting process for avian influenza is a two-week cycles. So you make the compost piles, they have to get up to 130 degrees for 3 days within that 2 weeks. You turn the piles another 2 weeks, and that's one of the pieces that releases the quarantine on the infected premise. The other piece is cleaning the buildings, going through a virus elimination phase and a fallow period, a 2-week fallow period. So again, all of these things tie together. The more quickly you mass depopulate, the quicker you're going to get your buildings cleaned up. We have producers that were infected the middle of March that are currently, its quarantines have been released and they're restocking now. But composting's up, but 30 semi-loads, when 5 million, we're talking hundreds of semi-loads of compost. In Iowa, we were tapping out our compost resources in northwest Iowa. We were starting to haul compost from eastern Iowa towards the Mississippi River. So those pieces start to come into play, but the producers were originating their own carbon sources. One of the key things here, it also happened this year, is the producers did everything. I mean, they controlled what happened onto their farm. Contractors didn't come in from the outside, and that was a huge lesson from 2015. If you let the government come in and hire contractors and damage to buildings and the speediness of how it happened, if a producer takes ownership and controls those things on their own, they're far better off. But I'm not going to paint a rosy picture. That's not all easy. And as I just mentioned, compost, we had one site, the compost started on fire, and they had to get more carbon. So, I mean, I guess what I'm saying, you can't plan for everything, but you better have the core plan in place. So when you see clinical signs, you make the call, and you have to step through those pieces. If you don't have a plan, and that's why, and we still have a lot of planning to do with ASF within the department and further outline some of these details, because shallow burial, one of the issues right now with the composting shallow burial, how do we know virus is inactivated? When I describe composting, thermometers are stuck in the compost piles. Right now, we don't have a way to monitor temperatures in a shallow burial composting. So there's a few things as regulators we need to work through there too. Incinerators, 2015, we had very few birds were run through an incinerator, but you've got the emissions. We had birds that were put in black bags and roll-off dumpsters. When they were hauled to the incinerator, they had to be dumped because we couldn't burn the bags because of carcinogens put into the air. So we had to dump the birds out of the bags, put the birds into the incinerator, and then we had to disinfect the bags, and then they were put in the landfill. So I guess, again, all the pieces, make sure you have a plan on your farm of what's going to happen, because it was mentioned, as the state of Iowa, we're not going to leave anything that's infected move off of an infected premise. And we held to that this year with avian influenza, that we didn't allow anything that could have been infective leave the farm. So those are the main points I wanted to bring up, and hopefully drive home some of the points that Stephanie and Marguerite mentioned, that those pieces are all real. If you have a plan, you're going to be far better off than if you're starting from scratch.